admit that it's based on a wonderful book of the same name, and we'll be talking about that shortly. But for now, let's get into the material. And just a quick hello from me. There's my face if you've never seen me before. Nice to see you guys too. So our series this evening is the second in the Positive Psychology series. So just a quick reminder for anyone who may perhaps have just joined us right now, or maybe you weren't on the class last week. What's this all about? What's this got to do with coaching? Well, positive psychology is a recent branch of the psychology practice. It's focused on building strong individuals, families and communities. Now, positive psychologists, as opposed to traditional psychologists, seek to find and nurture genius and talent, and to make normal life more fulfilling. So in that way, they're a lot like coaches, I guess, and the techniques they use are not the same as us, but we do have some crossover, most certainly. And positive psychology is used as a complement to traditional psychology, and it emphasises the scientific method, or test, operate, test and exit, in determining how things go right in our lives. So what positive psychologists do is actually, in that respect, quite similar to coaches. They examine where people have had great results before in their lives, and they wonder if perhaps that could be applied in the current situation, and then they come up with a methodology to make that happen, and they have the client test that theory, so by applying those changes, then operate, and then test again, and then exit. So it's a way of approaching problem solving with perhaps a more scientific method. And positive psychology focuses on four main topics. It focuses on the psychology of positive experiences, so exactly what goes into making up those positive experiences, and the enduring psychological traits of people who have a very good experience of life, a very positive experience of life, and it seeks to understand and then emulate those enduring psychological traits. It focuses also on not only internal positivity and relationships, but also your external relationships. So really focusing on having healthy relationships with your loved ones, your family, the community, and so on. And it also focuses on building positive institutions. So again, same as last week, we described this. We're talking here about hospitals, schools, educational institutions and businesses. So that's positive psychology, and that's the little area that we're focusing on this 3-week period. So what does this have to do with coaching? Well, I want to further explore the idea last week and build on the ideas of last week that our brains are actually constantly changing. And I really want to explore this thinking that our brains are hardwired. So have you ever perhaps heard someone say, that's just me, I can't help it, that's just me, that's what I'm like. Maybe I can't help it, I've always been like this, this is just who I am. Maybe you've had a client say, oh, I'm too set in my ways to change, that would be too difficult. Or maybe it's going to take forever to change that. And as coaches, guys, we need to believe that our clients are capable of huge change, and also that it's available to us in an instant. And this forms the basis of our practice, and it must form the basis of our belief system as well. Now, of course, I believe this is true, and I'm sure that you do too, otherwise you wouldn't be a coach. But the challenge can be understanding it on a hard facts level, on a scientific level, not just feeling it like some self-help guru. So you might say to someone, oh, but you're capable of change instantly, and their reaction is going to be pretty much, yeah, right. Well, you know what? That's just me. I don't change. I can't change. I've been the same my whole life. So in fact, actually a lot of the scientific evidence that we've had until recently has actually tended to back up that theory. Since the days when scientists and doctors discovered that certain functions of our brain seem to happen in certain physical locations of the brain, as we spoke about last week, so for example in the occipital lobe, that blue part down the bottom there, which is responsible for the visual processing, we have definitely believed more and more that view that brain mechanics are fixed and cannot be changed. So as a society, we've sort of taken on this belief that, well, you know, aren't they clever, the scientists have figured out that this part of your brain does this and that part of your brain does that, and we've sort of just subscribed to that notion, and therefore we're basically saying, well, that can't be changed then. If that's how it works, it's like a machine, it can't be changed. And this view has been called localizationalism. Say it with me, localizationalism. And this is the theory that the location is everything and it determines the exact functioning of the brain cells. Kind of like what we were speaking about last week. Now, in terms of psychological practice, there are a couple of different approaches, and localizationalists are very, very strong adherents to that rule, and they will do anything they can to see that rule to be true and to treat their patients as such. So they will work within the confines of that belief. And this indeed even fits in with the wider world view that we've adopted since the Industrial Revolution, that the body works like a machine, with each part doing its own little job and operating as nothing more than a physical piece in this machine. We saw how machines worked with all their moving parts, and we started to think of the body in exactly the same way. And traditional medicine certainly historically has had that kind of view. We've viewed each part of the body as separate. Certainly we recognise the relationships between them, but any idea of adaptability, or sometimes was called very far-fetched. And machines do many, many wonderful and exciting things, we know that, but logic tells us that machines cannot grow or change by themselves. They're fixed. That's the stuff that science fiction is made of, that other stuff. So this mechanistic worldview has really influenced not only our thinking about the body and the brain and all of the science and the medicine behind that, but even to the very core of ourselves as human beings, our human nature. If the body and brain are fixed and they can't be changed, then surely our personalities, which essentially arise from our bodies and our brains, must also be fixed and unchangeable. And that's the common worldview that really is where we're up to right now in terms of popular thinking. Well, thank goodness for us as coaches that actually seems not to be the case. In the 1960s and 70s, around the same time that Bandler and Grinder were playing with that wonderful thing called NLP, scientists at the forefront of brain science made a series of unexpected discoveries. Now remember, up until then, they really believed in that localizationalist theory, and they believed that the brain was fixed and couldn't be changed. And what they discovered was it seemed that despite the idea of these fixed brain cells performing fixed functions, that there was actually a degree of adaptability present in the structure of our brains. And when they investigated this further, scientists uncovered that the old idea of the fully mechanical brain that was fixed and unable to change seemed not to be 100% true. And that was all they could put their fingers on at the time. They had very, very, in terms of today's technology, very, very old-fashioned technology to help them investigate these ideas. So all they could say was, yeah, I don't know, it seems kind of to be not 100% true. They actually discovered that the brain changed its physical structure at times internally when required and adapted to new situations. For example, when people who lost the use of a certain part of their body in time learned to make up for that by more fully utilising other parts of their body. So they saw this happening and they said, well, how can this be if the brain is fixed? If certain parts of the brain failed through damage, then other parts could sometimes take over. And the scientists at the time had no language for this. It was a brand new discovery, and so they started to call it neuroplasticity. So what does neuroplasticity mean? Well, neuro refers to neuron, the particles that the brain is made up of, and plastic means changeable or able to be modified. So neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. Now, from an educator's point of view, myself speaking as a teacher and trainer for a long time, I love that this is true because this is how people continue to learn their whole lives. But it's even more than that. Get ready for a wild ride because I'm about to tell you some really funky experiments and all kinds of weird stuff going on inside our brains all the time. And I want you to think for a moment about the implications of these early discoveries. What we were seeing was fundamental proof on a cellular level that change is possible and that growth in our learning, our personalities, and even our brain function actually never stops. Interesting. In his outstanding book, The Brain That Changes Itself, Dr. Norman Doidge says this very quote: "The idea that the brain can change its own structure and function through thought and activity is, I believe, the most important alteration in our view of the brain since we first sketched out its basic anatomy and the workings of its basic component, the neuron." And now, advances in brain scanning and mapping technologies are allowing us even more insight into the workings of our minds. It's really cool stuff. So hang on to your hats, let's have a look. So what does this mean? What does this mean for us as coaches and why is it so important? Knowing this from scientific evidence is so useful because we can actually know that when our clients experience change, that they are literally rewiring their brains. We know from last week that the neurons that fire together wire together. You remember that stuff, right? And those that used to be connected with neural pathways actually start separating when new neural pathways are forged. And we also know that aspects of our clients' behaviour and personality that they want to change, even the most fixed, rigid and ingrained habits can be changed at a physical level in the brain. So it's not just an attitudinal or behavioural change or an intelligence change that we're seeing, but it's actually the brain physically altering, new neural pathways being formed, and as we're about to see, even more cool stuff going on inside their brains. So this opens up limitless opportunities for change to our clients, and it also gives them rock solid confidence that this is unquestionably possible. This is a very useful thing for our clients to understand. It's a convincer strategy for them to know that change at the physical brain level is actually possible. And guys, this is not normal conversation. People don't have this conversation sitting around the dinner table. So when you talk to them about this stuff, it's really going to be very interesting to see their reactions. And I bet what you're going to see is suddenly a lot more acceptance of change and a lot more ease with change because they understand that it is just a natural functioning part of who we are and our physical bodies. Sometimes our clients will see change as impossible until we remind them of the brain's ability to rewire as required. So let's have a look at some cool stories that you can share with your clients as evidence, and most importantly, this is how I use this stuff with my clients, as inspiration. I know a couple of these stories off by heart and I use them to tell my clients where suitable when they're really struggling with making a change. So I know that unfortunately many of us might know someone who's had a stroke. In fact, I had a very, very healthy family. Well, I still have a very healthy family, but as a young girl I never experienced anyone in my family or my close friends having had a stroke. And then when I was living in Japan, I must have been maybe about 26 years old, a friend of mine from Canada who was 28 had a massive stroke one afternoon. She was in the shower and she unfortunately lived by herself. So she was in the shower, she fell down into the running water, and it was the middle of winter in Osaka. And so for anyone who's been over there, it's cold enough to sometimes snow, not very often, but sometimes. And after about 3 or 4 hours of the hot water running on, my friend collapsed in the bath underneath her shower. The gas switched itself off. And we, after 2 days, noticed that she wasn't around, and we started making inquiries. She hadn't been to her job, she'd missed a couple of appointments, and she was going to have dinner with me one night and never showed up, which was not like her at all. So my friends and myself did everything we could to find her, and eventually some friends who lived close to her broke into her apartment with the help of some very unfriendly police officers who insisted on turning the other way so they wouldn't arrest the foreigners breaking into an apartment. They discovered her in the bath, and at the time they found her, they actually thought she was dead because she was so blue from the cold of being under cold running water for 3 days in a row. And actually, at the time, when they found her, they thought she had passed away. And then my friend Jason said, no, she's still breathing. So they hauled her out of the bath and took her off to hospital. And they discovered, after some scans and a bit of toing and froing in the Japanese medical system, that's another story, that she had actually had a stroke. She'd had a massive stroke at 28 years old. Now, luckily, actually, in the cold weather, the cold water, they say actually probably was one of the things that saved her, because it brought her body temperature right down and brought all of her systems right down nearly to hibernation mode. So that was a very fortunate thing for her in her case. Now, when she woke up out of her coma, she was in a coma for about 6 or 7 days, I think, and it was very sad. It was over Christmas time, and a lot of the foreign English teachers in Japan will go home over Christmas time and go visit their family and friends. So it was me and my friend in hospital and a couple of others who were left to sort of be on watch with her. I was talking to the nurses and doctors all the time in my very limited Japanese medical terminology, and they were doing a wonderful job of looking after her, but they said there was really very little chance of her ever waking up. And I was in contact with her mum in Canada, who said, basically, can you please make the arrangements for her to have a funeral? And so that was what was happening for me. But for my friend, what was going on was her brain was in a huge state of disrepair. She'd had a lot of brain cells damaged and a lot of oxygen cut off to her brain after the stroke. When she woke up from her coma, which they didn't expect her to do, she was unable to recognise anyone. She couldn't focus her eyes. She didn't know any of us. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. There was very little that we could do for her. So I was just visiting her every day and spending time with her, and we were playing music for her and doing all that good stuff. Now, over the next 2 weeks, they moved her into a ward where basically they put people who there was no hope for them, and they were just waiting for her family to come and pick her up from Canada. And what happened was, at the time, the Japanese were calling it a miracle. I witnessed it firsthand. She just started coming out of it, and day by day, and for anyone who has had a family member or a friend go through this, I know that you've seen the same things. Day by day, just a little bit more of her came back. So at first her recognition of friends started to increase, and then she started being able to say words. They weren't words that made sense at the time, but eventually we got to the point where she could say half of someone's name, then she could maybe string a couple of words together, and after about a month she actually was, I'd say, probably 50% mentally back with us, and she had also started doing physical therapy. Now at that point her husband, her Japanese husband, took her home to Canada. He hadn't been around, he'd been travelling, so he had to cut short his travels and come flying back to Osaka when this happened. She eventually, in Canada, after a lot of physical therapy, speech therapy and treatment back home, she actually regained about 95% of her physical and mental function. And to this day, I still think of her as a miracle, because the only thing that's really troubling her now is she has a slight fuzzy patch in her memory around that time. She can't really remember about the 6 months before the stroke happened, and she limps a little bit with one foot. So for someone who, when they first woke up, couldn't speak, didn't recognise anyone, couldn't even focus her eyes, her recovery has just been the most extraordinary thing. And as you know, when someone has a stroke, it's not like the flu where recovery just happens at a cellular level eventually. To the contrary, the blood flow has been cut off to the brain, and it permanently damages or kills large area of brain tissue. When there are miracle recoveries like my friend's, it's often a case that the surviving areas of the brain have, in time, learned to take over at least some of the functioning of the parts that have been killed or atrophied. allowing patients to partially recover or nearly make a full recovery. And this is neuroplasticity in action. This is an example that we see in medical history and in medical examples all the time of neuroplasticity happening in our system and in our lives. And this is backed up by another story from The Brain That Changes Itself. I found a very similar story. There was a neurologist who worked with his father who'd had a stroke, and he could no longer walk or use his dominant hand. He was right-handed. And though much of the older gentleman's brain had been damaged by the stroke, over the course of 18 months of very, very tough physical work, like he retaught himself to move first by pulling himself along the wall with his good arm, and that was a lot of the same stuff that my friend went through. He was able to remap the brain, allowing other areas that are not normally associated with physical movement to take over those tasks. So the parts of the brain that control physical movement had atrophied and had died and were no longer able to be used. And what happened was other parts of the brain started firing up. And it took some time for that recovery to happen, and he never fully completed his recovery 100% to his earlier state. He managed to walk again, and he regained the use of his dominant hand. And this was something that the neurologists who were treating him at the time, who were very, very localizationalist in their approach, they said, this will never happen for this gentleman. He's going to have to learn to do everything with his left hand. So think about the implications of this. If your client says that they can't possibly change an old pattern, then you can always talk to them about the miracle or the amazing recovery of stroke patients who've literally had some of their brain cells die off, and then they've been able to relearn skills using other parts of their brain so that in time that they can live a full life again. That is proof, and I hope it's proof enough for your client who's resisting making a change that any kind of change is possible given the intention and the tenacity to make it happen. So I really want to reinforce to everyone, including and your clients, you must teach this to your clients as well, that change is possible at a cellular level. Okay, so what if your clients are not into talking about stroke patients? Maybe they'd rather talk about monkeys. There have been some incredible experiments done in recent years in mind mapping that help us see exactly what part of the brain is lit up with electrical impulses when different things are going on. So when you're moving this finger, this part of the brain lights up, and when you're moving this finger, this part of the brain lights up. Some of the most fascinating results have happened when scientists in the early days have mapped monkeys' brain maps. And they were mapped and then manipulated to see what differences could be observed. The American neuroscientist Dr. Michael Merzenich performed micromapping experiments where he electronically mapped the exact part of a monkey's brain that was related to the stimulation of each part of their hand and each of their fingers individually. Now, this might sound like, oh yeah, maybe a week-long kind of thing. No, this took years. Just to map the hand took years, because think about it. It's not just one neural pathway that lights up when someone touches, say, your little finger or your thumb or whatever, but a bunch of them all connected through a neural net in a certain part of the brain. So all of those neural networks are very, very intricately connected, and the level of detail that they go to with these mind mapping experiments in order to see exactly which part of the brain relates to exactly which part of the hand is really quite extraordinary. So Dr. Merzenich performed a very, very complex and detailed mind mapping experiment, and then he wanted to see what would happen when something changed and how the brain would respond. Now, for anyone who is a monkey fan, forgive me, I'm just going to talk for a moment about what happened in this experiment. He cut a nerve in the monkey's hand, so I hope that doesn't make anyone squeamish. He cut a nerve in the monkey's hand which relates to the sensation in the middle of the hand. It's called the median nerve. And what he discovered was that the portion of the brain map that serves the median nerve showed no activity after having had it cut. So basically, the nerve had been cut, the link to the brain had been broken, and that part of the monkey's brain was just not lighting up with electrical impulses of sensation when their hand was touched. So after about 2 months, he was expecting there to be some change to that, and he gave the monkey 2 months for new things to go on and new neural pathways to be formed, and he went back then and remapped the hand again. And what he did discover after 2 months, where the brain had time to readjust, that the part of the brain that would have lit up with the electrical signals from the median nerve was instead now part of the neural network for other nerves in the hand. And it lit up like a Christmas tree when the outside of the monkey's hand was stroked. And it lit up the part of the brain that was connected to the radial and ulnar nerves, so the nerves on the outside of the hands. So what had happened? These two outside nerves, these two networks to do with the radial and ulnar nerve network, inside the brain had increased, and they'd taken over what was dead or unutilized real estate in the brain. This is massive. This has huge implications for us as adults, because it proves that old saying, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. In other words, brain plasticity is competitive. The brain is like a piece of real estate with several different house blocks. And if one house block is dormant for a long time and nothing's going on and there's a few weeds growing, then the people on the neighbouring block will just bust down the fence and move their stuff over into the empty block so that they can do more with their stuff. So if you've ever asked yourself why you can't remember exactly how you used to play guitar, or why you can't read music anymore, or why you can't speak Japanese anymore, yes, I'm talking about the things that I've lost, but I'm sure you have too. As a kid, was there a language that you spoke? Was there an art form that you did that you no longer quite have the skills for? What you're really asking is, have we forgotten those skills forever? Are the brain cells dead? And the answer is no, but those brain cells, that real estate, has been taken up by something else, by some other neural network that you're using far more often. Perhaps it's to do with coaching. So competitive plasticity in adults explains even some of our limitations. For example, some of the difficulties that we have in breaking old habits. Every time we perform an old habit, like smoking, we build more and more neural pathways around that habit, and we make the connections in our brain around that habit stronger, deeper, and more complex. And in order to break that habit, we must understand that we have a very complex neural network around it. So just stopping cold turkey, has anyone tried to ever quit something cold turkey? Have you had success? If so, it's a very unusual thing. You've had incredible other resources available to you that are even stronger than that neural network, that physical path in your brain that was established through that old habit. So a very effective way to break an old habit is actually to create a new habit, a replacement behaviour, and quickly build a large body of knowledge, practice, vocabulary, and increase the neural network around that new habit if you want to break the old pathways. We're essentially trying to build a bigger neural net around the new habit than currently exists for the old one, which is what must happen for the new habit to dominate and the old one to eventually break down, for those neurons to stop firing together. Remember from class last week, eventually neurons that don't fire together, eventually they are no longer wired together, they physically break apart. So this knowledge helps us understand some of the reasons behind breaking, the difficulties behind breaking habits, but more than that, far more usefully, it helps us understand what needs to happen if we want to break the old habits or assist our clients to do so. And this helps us to be better, more effective coaches who help our clients achieve success far more of the time. We increase our likelihood of success if we follow some of these suggestions that are given to us by this discipline of neuroplasticity. Perhaps what's most interesting about neuroplasticity then is that we actually have choice and influence over it. Are you sensing a theme from last week's class? The human brain, much like any other part of the body, can be developed through exercise. The more we practice a particular skill, the stronger it becomes, and inside the brain, the neural networks that are responsible for that skill basically grow thicker. They allow the connection to be made much more easily, and they have a lot more detail around them. But it's not simply physical skills or activities that can be strengthened. It can be our attitudes, our dispositions, our behaviours as well. And so this knowledge just reinforces for us on another level that we truly are what we think. What are those pathways that you're going down habitually all the time? And do you want to change them? Because if you want to, then it's simply a matter of creating a new neural network around a preferred thought pattern. It also explains our ability to change our own mental patterns and our overall personality, should we choose to do so. So remember, what you focus on is what you get. Helping a client who is doing depression can include all kinds of different techniques, absolutely. And there are many, many very valuable techniques that you know and that you're building on as coaches. But one very simple and powerful technique to assist them in making this change, and a fundamental underlying concept, is to help them change the brain activity around depression. So helping them to cultivate a new habit. Instead of the habit of depression, what new habit can we help them cultivate? So I think a fantastic one is gratitude. Gratitude is a great habit to get into, and it makes it very, very difficult to feel sadness at the same time. We all have an incredible untapped potential due to neuroplasticity, but we must harness it and be conscious of it and use it with intention in order to make the best of ourselves and our lives. So a couple of really great examples there, and certainly examples from an example from adults and one from monkeys, but certainly transferable to the adult experience. But I want to finally tell you about a radical example of just how plastic the brain can be, even when half of it has been removed. And this is, I'm reading straight from an article for the moment. It's an article which I'll give you credit for at the end, and you can have a look at it yourselves online and use it for your clients if you want to. So it's called The Girl with Half a Brain. For 3 years, little Cameron Mott's life was a nightmarish succession of violent seizures that consumed her days and threatened her life. Finally, doctors told her parents that there was a way to stop them. All they had to do was remove half of Cameron's brain. It was not a diagnosis that a parent wants to hear, and going through with the operation was not an easy decision. But the alternative was a steady deterioration of the right half of Cameron's brain, and eventually her whole life. Now, this article is taken from an interview on the Today Show in America. So Shelley Mott, Cameron's mum, said to the Today Show, "It was very scary because you just can't imagine what your child will be like after such a dramatic brain surgery. It just doesn't seem like they could be the same child. How is that possible?" But eventually, what they discovered after the radical surgery was that bit by bit, Cameron came back to them. So the story really began 6 years ago when she was 3 years old. She suddenly started having seizures, and a video supplied by the Motts to doctors showed the girl playing happily, and then suddenly going completely rigid and collapsing headfirst on the floor. Now the Motts took Cameron to the doctors for 3 years, all these different doctors, and they conducted hundreds of examinations in an effort to discover what was happening, 10 or more seizures a day. And the whole time her brain function was deteriorating and she was starting to lose the ability to speak. And finally they diagnosed her condition. It's called Rasmussen syndrome, and it's a condition that causes the destruction of one side of the brain. And the only solution available was very radical. It's called a hemispherectomy, which means removing half of her brain. So the surgery took more than 7 hours, and since the left side of the body is controlled by the right side of the brain, the doctors knew that Cameron would be paralysed on her left side when she woke. But they also knew that the brains of children especially are amazingly able to rewire themselves. And the doctors have said in this interview with NBC News, we like to do children because of their ability or their plasticity. That's the ability of the other side of the brain that we haven't removed to take over and control the function of the diseased half that we're removing. Now, the little girl was immobilised for the first 2 days after surgery to allow her brain to stabilise, and then she went into an intensive physical therapy program. 4 weeks after the surgery, she walked out of hospital. 4 weeks. So the decision that the Motts had to make had turned out to be right, and her mum says, looking back, it was absolutely the right choice. And really for us, when we knew what she had and we knew that this was our only option to help her, the risk was something that we were willing to deal with because her quality of life was so poor and it was still deteriorating. Now, amazingly, Cameron was able to return to school. She's now in the 2nd grade and she's a good student. Her physical therapy sessions have just finished and she can run and play. She has a slight limp and she wears a brace on her left leg. And she's lost a little bit of her peripheral vision. But when the interviewers asked Cameron if she had any effects after the surgery, she said, nope, none at all. I'm a normal girl. And that's just a wonderful example of how plastic the brain can be. So removing half of the brain, which we know controls half of the functions, can result in absolute disaster in terms of injuries, but done correctly and given the right opportunity to heal, that little girl's brain basically recreated itself. And what happened in terms of neuroplasticity was her brain economized on some of the functions. So when they map out a brain that has had severe damage like that, what they find is that normally a certain percentage of the brain will be taken up with certain functions, and they find that the neural networks are tighter and smaller and they take up less real estate, so that the functioning area of the brain, whilst it's smaller, can still contain most of the regular functions of a full brain. So that will conclude this evening's class. Neuroplasticity, a most amazing thing to share with your clients. And in terms of really teaching us about the change that is possible due to the incredible thing that is our brain and ourselves as humans, but also our ability to use that with intention and choice, I really encourage you to integrate this into your practice and to teach your clients about it when you think they're ready. And absolutely grab yourself a copy of The Brain That Changes Itself. I've only used a couple of examples from the book. There are actually maybe about 6 or 7 major stories in there that you can memorize and tell your clients about incredible changes that have happened for people. So the other credit there, if you want to have a look at that article, that was where I found it on the internet. So it was on Today, MSNBC at msn.com. So have a look for that one. And What the Bleep Do We Know? I also drew a little bit of material for tonight's class out of there again. So thank you for your attention this evening. And now, Doc, if you're there, I'll open up for any questions or comments. And thank you for being with me tonight, guys.
Hey, Catherine, I definitely am here. Really great class.